I'm very grateful to be here, and I have really enjoyed the presentations. And I spend most of my life in law faculties, and law faculties have an isolationist tendencies. Even though I have always done empirical research, we tend to keep to ourselves because, after all, law is so close to power, and you know, who else is, and authority. So who else is can compete with the legal scholarship and so on. But anyways, it's wonderful to share your work. And what I have noticed is that many of presentations either directly or indirectly connected to law. When we talk about institutions, it's really difficult not to, at one stage, get into law, or at least normativity and social control. Institutions are about social control in one way or another. What I thought I'll do today is to pick up some of the debates we had yesterday, where we left off with the definition of institutions, and make an attempt to present my own version, what fits my research, my own definition of institution, which is really developed in relation to law. And then I will go straight to law and introduce law as an institution, as a social institution, before I discuss how law changes as we move from earlier stages of modernity, which was marked by industrialization and manufacturing industries, which had materiality, to service economy, right? What I would like to show is how law changes character and emphasis as we move towards, from a very materialistic type of production towards a non-materialistic, non-material service economy. And what does it mean for law, and where is it heading? Of course, I will, historians would not like my presentation, of course, because I will talk about stages. However, I admit from the beginning that these stages overlap, and this is actually one of my arguments. I will be referring to the concept of late modernity, which is very problematic in itself, and this work is actually a critique of, contains a critique of late modernity. And I will argue against people like Zygmunt Bauman, who talk about liquefaction of society. And one of my arguments is that not everything melts away in late modernity. However, late modernity is something which focuses our attention on the latest developments. So this is how I have arranged it. So I start with discussions about law and institutions, and then I'll go through 4 stages of developments, from industrial society to welfare state, and then to globalization, and finally we'll be asking questions about what happens to law and legal institutions in cyberspace. Right, this is the definition I have used. So I'm very sympathetic with the discussions on this side of the workshop yesterday about emphasis on practices, and here I have placed I'm talking about reflexive monitoring of social relations across indefinite social time-space distances, and emphasizing cluster of practices. This is very close to Giddens's structuration theory, right? What I like about this definition is, it's a bit ad hoc. What I like about it is that it allows me to talk about practices and social control, and subsequently it really fits my discussions about law, right? So what is law as a social institution? In the law school, we start by disinforming our students that law is about rules, is about norms, is about, we teach them procedure, which is very important, and above all, doctrine. This is the ultimate normativity of the law emerges after doctrine, and obviously decisions, irrespective of whether you're in a common law jurisdiction or a civilian jurisdiction, previous decisions are very important. Those of you who have come across Nicholas Luhmann's definition of systems is based on law, law reproduces itself by referring back to its previous communications decisions. So this is a very important aspect of law, law as a system of rules and the foundation of modern legal theory, really. However, law is many other things. Yesterday we were talking about the legal profession. So law can be discussed in terms of legal profession, right? It has its own mechanism and so on. It can be discussed as an education. It is an education, in fact, which is linked to legal profession. Above all, a form of discourse. Legal argumentation has its own mechanism. If it is unique, we can discuss it, right? The uniqueness of legal argumentation is negotiable, is something which can be questioned. It definitely has its own form of discourse. It has texts which have materiality, and courts and so on. Again, they've got materiality, right? So not everything about law is discourses. There are a lot of materiality involved in law. One of the things I like about Latour, who have also published a book on law, even though he argues that he doesn't know anything about law, is that he points out and he teases out all these materialities of the law and explains how these are related to each other in a network. So it's many of these discursive aspects of law would not really work without the material aspects of it. Materiality is something that I will come back several times to and point out how important it is, and the fact that we tend to leave it out from our analysis. However, law is an instrument to do things with. Any practicing lawyer would tell you that, right? Good lawyers, they might or might not know their rules and doctrines. Somebody said that, I don't know who it was, that not everybody knows all the laws, right? Yes, lawyers don't know all the laws. They've got to check it out, right? They usually specialize in one particular area, but it doesn't mean that they know all the rules and laws. But what is important for a lawyer is to win. That is the most important thing. And if the rules and doctrine works for the lawyer, that is fantastic. If it doesn't, they throw it out of the window. Right. Delays. That's wonderful. You just delay everything, right? Indefinite delays of cases could be a solution to your problem. So law is very practical. Now, going back to discussions of institutions, law is at the same time a social institution, right? With its own practices, with its own form of knowledge, with its own spaces, and all that sort of things. But what is different about law, which does its own self-monitoring all the time, right? So it is, law creates and recreates itself by monitoring its own practices. It also monitors other social systems and other social institutions. Other institutions would do that too, in different ways. But law does it normatively, and it regards this function as one of its primary operations, to also not only to normatively regulate its own operations, but also to regulate other systems operations. And this is something which has been developed by Jürgen Habermas very nicely in the context of his partly confrontations with Nicholas Luhmann, but also the development of welfare state. Which is going back to works of Habermas from 1975 to 1980 when he wrote The Legitimation Crisis, and later he wrote his book on the theory of communicative action. He defines law partly as an institution which institutionalizes norms and values which require moral justification in everyday life. The best example is criminal law. Right? It is about moral and values which are central to, say, at the cultural level, are very important, and law comes in, supports them, and institutionalizes them, and creates a link between the law, if you like, as a system or as an institution, and Lebenswelt. And partly it works as a steering medium, regulating the operations of other social systems like economy, polity, administration, and so on. Under ideal situation, the perfect balanced situation, the combination of law as an institution and law as a steering medium would create legitimacy for law. Of course, the whole discussion and the concern of Habermas and others is that it doesn't do that. Why? Because the system, this is Habermas's argument, that the system colonizes the life world and causes imbalances. Right. So this is my background to law and social institutions. I should mention from the beginning that a lot of the discussions I've got in this, and also I have circulated a paper. In the paper is really, it falls back on the developments in Britain, and Britain provides a fantastic point of departure for these discussions because one can use it in a Weberian way as an ideal type. A lot of the discussions, developments, are quite pronounced in Britain because of the way market economy has developed since 1980s in Britain. But also, I'll be talking about risk management strategies, as Julia Black and Robert Baldwin have argued. Many governments and regulators in the UK are now employing risk-based regulatory strategies, frameworks for management of their resources and their reputations. So I will come back to risk management, and one of the arguments is that law is moving away from that traditional way of institutionalizing norms and values, and what we have seen the operations of law in the welfare state towards risk management. And of course, the best example of it is not only in Britain, but in most countries, the best example is anti-terrorism legislation, right, which does not care about resolving anything. And this is one of the moves of law, right? Law from welfare state, which was engaged with social issues, moving to a new area where it is not really engaged socially anymore. All it cares about is to avoid problems, right? So this is, if you like, that's as close as I get here to a research question. In the paper, what happens to law and legal regulation as we move from early stage of modernity, which was dominated by manufacturing industry and formed by industrial relations, into late modernity characterized by sociocultural implications of globalization, the growth of service economy, and the spread of information technology. And this is the notion of late modernity, which is as woolly as it can get. Should not be, nevertheless, it should not be confused with post-modernity. So late modernity is really a continuation of modernity. It does not introduce a break in the concerns of modernity. The argument is that as globalization accelerates, it affects reflexivity of agency. Right? this is central to the paper. Of course, reflexivity is nothing new. Humans have always been reflexive. Even Plato wrote about reflexivity, right? So it goes back all the way to ancient philosophy. But it became central to the development of modernity, and it is about breaking free from traditional constraints. But the argument here in the paper is as globalization accelerates and we move into network society and so on, reflexivity also accelerates. So the ability of the individual to free itself, take a step back and calculate, consider its relationship with social structures, it become more and more. And this automatically has an impact on social control, institutional control. So if you can take a step back and free yourself from the traditional social control and the traditional institutionalized form mechanisms of regulation, then obviously it becomes more and more difficult to control you, legally or otherwise. So this is part of the argument. And there is quite a lot of empirical studies which show, for example, in respect to identity, how new generations can recreate their identity and the way they present themselves online, for example. So there is a whole body of research which supports this increased reflexivity. Right, late modernity as I said, is a difficult concept. One way to visualize it, one way is to discuss it is to start by visualizing it. And the way I would like to start with Lowry's paintings from 1930s. Michael is not here. He was making references to Lancashire and the fact that knowledge was hanging in the air in Lancashire, and this is Lancashire, right? And not only knowledge, but a lot of smoke is hanging in the air, of course. The wonderful thing about Lowry is that he produced hundreds of paintings like that, and he was not taken very seriously during his lifetime as an artist, because this was not the landscape that the art elite wanted to see. It doesn't really represent the green hills and landscape of Britain. But he produced many of these. This is another one. And there are several things about his paintings that I like. One of them is the fact that there is so much solidity in it, right? You can't miss the materiality of industrialization here. So not only this industrialization was bulky, it brought with it certain relationships like wage labor. Wage labor enabled people to plan over time, right? Previously, you couldn't do that. Now, industrialization had a lot of ups and downs, right? It was not a stable economic organization at all. But nevertheless, it brought a lot of materiality and it brought a lot of wealth, not only to the bourgeois and the capitalists, but also improved the conditions of workers. So, and we continue to enjoy the wealth of industrialization. And it has not completely disappeared. This is one of my arguments, for example, against, say, Bauman, who argues that there has been a liquefaction of society, because really, if you go out and talk about it, not many people experience that the social reality has liquefied and has disappeared. So there is a lot of this materiality left, even though we have moved into those stages of production which are, we call it service economy and so on. Not everybody has completely. Germany is a very good example. Britain, for various reasons, have gone further in creating a service economy, but other countries, Germany, Sweden, and so on, got a lot of industrialization going on. And of course, China. We have moved a lot of manufacturing away to other countries, right? This has been the trend. What is really prominent in late modernity, if there is something which really cuts across all relationships and so on, is consumption, right? Is consumer society is very prevalent. This is something which is nobody can free himself or herself from consumption. It's just the question is how you do it, right? So otherwise, none of us can free ourselves. So these people, the other thing which is interesting about his paintings are these disenfranchised people, right? Yes, but they do have a sociality, right? There is a sense of togetherness here, that they have it. It is the calm before the storm, right? And the storm is, you can have a revolution on your hand, right? These people, there is a potential here that you can't get away from, which eventually brought about spread social welfare system. I agree with you. I remember that you mentioned that social welfare system started very early on in the 80s. That is very true. But these developed differently. And if you compare, you see that each country has its own way of doing it. So it was really a driving force, for example, in Britain, with introduction of social labor laws and social policies and so on, to stabilize, because not only industrialization not only brought with it unprecedented wealth, it also brought with it social conflict. You had to manage these. And welfare system was one way of doing it. However, welfare system was not only instrumental in that way. It wasn't only that wanted to neutralize social conflicts. There was a lot of liberal ideology involved in it too. A lot of people really believe, and Scandinavian countries are very good examples. They really believe in, for example, in Sweden, in creating what they call folkhem, a home for everyone, where you are given equal opportunity. So there was a lot of liberal ideology there too. This is engagement of the welfare state with the social sphere, right? And one of my arguments is that as we move away towards service economy, that we lose that engagement gradually. So it shows solidity. It shows how obdurate and opaque industrialization was, right? And there is something which is not only solid, but lack of movement in industrialization, that is early industrialization, which is interesting. Now, to tease it out, we can compare it with another painting. I apologize for the quality of the painting. I couldn't find a sharper one, but this is from the Danish painter Paul Ankerberg. One thing that he's got in common with Lowry is that he too produces similar paintings, hundreds of them. And what they've got in common is that a bit of Danish landscape has separated itself from Denmark and is floating in the air, right? And here you've got the Lady of Denmark sitting there in her old-fashioned attire, in a state of resignation or reflection, or, oh God, I don't know what's going on in her head, watching the other in prayer. looks like a Muslim praying to his God in the land of Lutherans, right? So this is and you see, the sense of sociality, the sense of potential conflict of revolution, and that sort of things has completely disappeared. Right? I mean, you can. I'm using that as to tease out the distinction. I mean, you can criticize me for comparing these two, right? These two paintings, but I quite like the way that things appear to have melted in the air for Paul Ankerbeck. There is sociality going on in the corner of the top corner of the painting, but it's so far away, right? It's in the background. God knows what's going on there. So there seems to be even people there, but so this is sort of, it just gives you an idea about late modernity. For me, that captures the essence of some aspects of the essential aspects of late modernity. So, liquid modernity refers to a society where the conditions under which its members act change faster than it takes the way of acting to consolidate into habits and routines. Right? This is going away from definitions of institution which emphasize stability and continuity, right? This is Bauman's definition. The problem with this is that it does not apply to all walks of life. That is what Bauman does, right? He uses it to describe everything which is happening in society, while in fact it is only part of certain walks of life have been influenced by this type of globalization. While certain groups of people, the elite live a very liquid life and can manage it, but it doesn't mean that everybody has been affected equally. So there is so as I said, one of the arguments of the paper is that not all that is solid melts into air. By the way, I don't know if you recognize the all that is solid melts into air. It's not Bauman's. It happens to be, I can't remember on what page, in the middle of the Communist Manifesto, says Marx and Engels make that statement. It's theirs, right? So they took it from Shakespeare, right? So, but this is one of the themes that is developed in the Communist Manifesto, but this is also very misleading, right? So what I'm going to do now is very quickly, in a few minutes which is left to me, go through 4 stages of modernity. Is industrialization. I try to use a few markers like knowledge, the relationship to a state, power. What sort of power is very important. It varies from stage to stage. So the first one, the relationship, this law is state law. It's very important, right? Law is the backbone of the state, and state is the backbone of law. These two are really, they work very closely together. Law has, or believes, legal institutions believe to have knowledge of the social. They know what to do with it, right? Power is social and economic, which is translated through political institutions. Jurisdiction is local, right? So law acts locally. And it ensures, now to borrow from Nicholas Newman, expectations of expectations, right? So it comes in and supports institutional settings and relationships which require normative support. This is one of the important things for law. And a very good example of this, and this example actually creates a bridge between early industrialization and welfare state is the development of employment law, which establishes a general legal framework for terms and conditions of employment, which grounds certain legal standards and values. So law comes in and introduces certain standards like fairness, equal treatment, reasonableness, to solidify, bring continuity in employment relationships. And this is it's a very good example, again, in the context of developments in Britain, because employment law has been changed, has been liquefied, in fact. It's not what the employment law does really these days. So this is stage one. The stage two is the gradual move into welfare state. And it's important to remember the welfare state really started much earlier, right? So it's not a clear-cut stages. But then after the Second World War, we've got a clear development of social policies and so on. And some of our disciplines, like sociology and sociology of law in particular, gained from this development. Right? Why? Because we could provide knowledge, which was required for making laws and policies. Right? So again, knowledge is accessible here. It's socially defined and accessible, and we become servants of the state, provide them with the knowledge that they can introduce social policies. So law is pretty much an instrument for engineering, for social engineering here. And again, the space for law's authority is local. Very briefly, I mean, I'm running out of time very quickly. So one of the things that sociology of law has shown is actually the lack of efficacy of laws in that relationship, right? Because you mentioned Selznick was one of the first people who showed that these laws have to go filter through institutional cultures, so they you don't affect them. Developments just by introducing laws. Right, I jumped over globalization. Right, so what is important about globalization, the relationships with states starts to change. Why? Because the state is transforming, is undergoing transformations, right? The state is not becoming weaker, as some people, like, again, Bauman is one of them. I don't want to bark at Bauman all the time, but he suggests that it gets weaker, but it's not. If anything, the state has become much more militarized, more powerful, and so on, but it draws itself back from its previous engagements and responsibilities, right? For various reasons. Partly it says that a lot of these things which are happening are outside my reach. That might be true or not. Partly it is for ideological reasons, and not interfering into the operations of the market economy, for example. So the relationship between law and state undergo a substantial change. The other thing is the increased reflexivity of the agency. It becomes much more difficult to control behavior. Knowledge becomes fragmented. That is another argument. The law says, I don't have the knowledge to control these areas. I don't know about these areas. So these are some of the developments. And the power is economic, but we are told that it is not ideological, right? It is part of the ongoing discourses, political discourses. Right, I've almost made it. Finally, cyberspace brings all these to a head. Law moves outside the state. If you want to regulate developments, online interaction, law can't do it. It's got to go through service providers. Service providers become the medium. They sit and make laws together, right? Because law does not know how to regulate it. It's got its own architecture, right? You need to know the architecture. So it's a completely different setup. And one of the wonderful things about this final stage is the change in the nature of power. Power becomes a property of the network. So just thinking in terms of bullying, for example, it is very unlikely, not improbable, but very, very unlikely that a 10-year-old boy could bully his 35-year-old teacher, right, in face-to-face interaction. Very difficult, but very easy to do online. So there are many cases of this type. Why? Because suddenly, if the 10-year-old is capable of making use of the power of the network, right, then it can transform his situation. So this is one of the wonderful, interesting things. My example is pretty negative, but there are obviously there are more positive, empowering potentials in the network. The last one, so what happens to law and legal regulation? Well, the first thing is, this is pretty much the state of things today. We generate a lot of hybrid legal regimes. Why? Because we've got these stages, some of them running parallel. We still do a lot of manufacturing and industrial relations and so on. We have moved into globalization, where a lot of corporations, multinational corporations, have moved out of the reach of the state and so on. So we've got the regimes which use all sorts of things, from ombudsman, watchdogs, monitored self-regulation and so on. And a lot of these, like corporate social responsibility, for example, we call them soft laws. We can also support them directly or indirectly by ordinary legal infrastructures. The other thing is the disengagement with the social and social responsibilities. And as I said, it's partly because the argument is that these spheres of social action move outside the reach of this state, but partly because the law does not have the knowledge of these areas. And I have to finish. This is from Kostas Douzinas' book, on a rather negative, pessimistic note. And I apologize for that. I'm working very hard on it. I'm trying to find something more cheerful to say about late modern law. But law is increasingly law because it calls itself law, and it has the authority and force to do so, right? And it only makes sense by going back to the previous, fairly historically short period. That is important, I think. It's a very short period of social welfare where there was an engagement with social justice. This becomes weaker and weaker. But as I said, I'm working on it. Thank you.